Welcome to the Conscious Living Podcast, conversations to educate, empower, and enlighten our world. An uplifting and inspiring series of conversations and talks with your host, Jackie Woodside. We are educating minds, empowering lives, and enlightening souls to create a world where love prevails. In this engaging podcast, we deliver exciting, positive, transformative talks and teachings designed to elevate your life. Now, let's join our host, Jackie Woodside, for this week's session.
Hello, everybody. Jackie Woodside here, the founder and the host of the Conscious Living Podcast, where we are here to educate, empower, and enlighten our world. Thank you so much for being here with us. I just can't say enough about how much I love this topic and how much I love people who are also committed to living life consciously. And one of the things that we have to deal with in life, living it consciously, is that the more that you go through life, the more you experience life, the more you are prone to experience losses. I know for myself, I experienced losses very, very early in my life. That created an interesting experience of complex grief for me, even though it was only as a toddler that I lost my father, my grandfather, and my father's brother, all in 9 months. So I have a profound relationship to this notion of grief, and it very much informed my early years, my developmental years. So today we're going to be diving into the notion of grief, and even more specifically, something that's called complex grief, which is when grief doesn't resolve itself. It doesn't kind of move on in the stages that it normally does. I'm going to be talking today with Dr. Michelle Petikolas, who is an expert and international bestseller of the book Step Into Your Brilliance, as well as several other books. She's an author and has created a lot of different books. She's an award-winning filmmaker, and her film called The Secrets of Life and Death, a professional speaker and life transformation coach, is also what she is known as. So she helps high-achieving women, midlife women, who've been thrown off track by a major loss, to help them release their complex grief and transmute it into the fuel that helps achieve their soul's purpose. Michelle, that's a beautiful commitment that you have in life. So welcome to the Conscious Living Podcast. Thank you for being here with us. Do you mind just saying a little bit more about yourself and your journey to helping women in midlife deal with complex grief?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Maybe I can start by giving you a little bit about my story, which in some ways is similar to yours, that the initial event that precipitated the complex grief in my life happened when I was 2 years old.
Oh, me too.
Yeah, 2 years old. So there's actually research on that, and that those first 3 to 5 years are crucial to the emotional and mental development of a child. And I think for years, the psychological community didn't know how important it was for us to bond and to connect both physically and emotionally with our parents. So parents brought their children up thinking that it was good enough just to ensure their well-being, feed them, clothe them, keep them warm, take care of them. But that other part was not really on their radar. So I have a lot of appreciation for my parents. My mother was an only child, and she had 2 children before she had me. So I was, if you can imagine, the traditional family back in the 1950s. My mother was overwhelmed. So she didn't bond with me. In fact, I think at that time, they were telling mothers not to breastfeed their children.
Wow.
So I didn't bond with her. I bonded with my father. And he was like the sun and moon to me. And this is all told to me because at 2 years old, what do you remember?
Right.
But when I was 2, he was transferred to Japan. He was in the U.S. Army, and he was moved to Japan. He didn't die. He didn't disappear out of the world, but he was gone long enough for me to lose my trust in him and my trust in myself.
And your connection to him.
And my connection. The connection was never the same after that. And I decided that there was something wrong with me. As, some 2-year-old might come up with that idea. And that the way to ensure my survival was to figure out what other people wanted from me and give it to them. And boy, did that work really well in school. Teachers love students that just focus on them and give them everything they want. So this got reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. I work with my parents too, that they gave me the attention. And I mean, there was a lot of competition. There were 6 children in my family by the time my parents finished having children.
Yeah.
So I went all the way up to my PhD, continuing to accumulate the approval. And then I reached adulthood, and it didn't work so well anymore. And I went through some major setbacks. I believed that the universe was trying to wake me up to a different way, because in a way, I had lost trust in myself. I lost connection with who I really was. So first, I got fired from my first teaching job. Then I finished my PhD, and I said, oh, the ultimate, the epitome, my worthiness is proven.
Yeah.
So my father, who I adored, I asked him, what do you think of my PhD? And he told me, oh, I'm so ashamed. I never got my BA. So here I am making my father ashamed. So that was my first response. Then my boss, who had a PhD, and I was working in these group homes, I said, would you introduce me to social services as Dr. Petikolas? And he said, why don't you tattoo it to your forehead?
Oh, wow.
Then my husband of 10 years left me for another woman because he got fired and I got promoted. Well, I don't know if that was the reason, but that was the sequence. And I was like, okay, I don't understand how this world works. And I ran away to a spiritual community and said, relationships don't matter. Work and achievement doesn't matter. I'm just going to surrender. But the reality is that I just traded my father, my boss, my husband for my spiritual teacher. And I put everything into that. The good news is that I did a lot of growing in that time. And I did a lot of work on myself. So that when my parents died, when I was in my late 40s, first my father and then my mother, I had a huge wake up. And my mother was like the poster child for living your passion. Back in the days when women did not live their passion. She was a toy designer. She had a partnership with my aunt, who was an amazing sculptor, and they took their designs to major toy companies in New York City and sold them.
That's amazing.
So she was like, whoa, what comes to the neglect of her 6 children? But she was amazing.
Yeah.
And we were sitting in her studio. She was dying of cancer. And I was going through some of her papers, trying to get ahead of, I was the taskmaster. I picked up one and I handed it to her. And it was one of her designs. It was just a photocopy. And she looks at it and she says, oh, I guess I'll never get to that project. Her words pierced my heart. My breath was taken away from me. I couldn't, finally I said, took it back. I said, we don't need to deal with this right now. And I cut off the conversation. I didn't know better. But also I was protecting myself because I was not used to my emotions. I had shut my emotions down when I was 2 years old. I was like strong. Plus, but people back then didn't express their emotions. We were taught to stiff upper lip, hold it in.
Be stoic.
Be stoic, yeah. And so afterwards, I thought, my mother said, I won't get to this project. And I, for the first time, understood what deadline really means. And I thought, well, if she, who was for me the epitome of living your passion, had regrets, where did that leave me? This person who was going out pleasing everybody else in the world and not myself. And that's when I decided to make the documentary film series. Well, it was first one documentary and it morphed into 3. And I got involved in hospice and started working as a grief and loss group facilitator. And that just eventually developed into working with people around in grief and loss. But always at the core of this, when I made the film, my purpose was to wake people up to this short but glorious life and to live it more fully. So we're totally in alignment with that. That was my mission.
Beautiful. I love that. And so you've developed a specialty around something called complex grief. How does that differ from your, average run-of-the-mill on-the-shelf grief? And how do people know that they've gotten to this phase of complex grief?
Right. Great question. So what I have found is that people who have complex grief usually have something in their childhood around abandonment. And that was my problem. And that was your problem. It was abandonment. It could be physical abandonment. It could be temporary medical abandonment. It could be emotional abandonment. A parent that wasn't able to meet their child's emotional needs. And what happens is that every time you go through an abandonment experience, all that accumulation of loss and the ways in which you've handled it aren't going to work in this particular moment of loss. And that's the opportunity, is that when you're hit with a significant loss, it kind of blasts through. It's like this explosion that blasts through your typical coping mechanism. And so it is this amazing opportunity to heal the early childhood wounds, to heal the whole pattern that we can often find ourselves in of believing that we're not worthy, that we're not good enough, and to really reclaim our power, to reclaim our trust in ourselves.
That whole notion of deciding that you're not worthy, not good enough, that's the human condition. And
It is.
Everyone has their own version of it. So it's not unique to complex grief, or it's not unique to abandonment. It is, I was a therapist for 30 years. I know that you've got a lot of experience listening to people tell their story. It is the human condition. Human beings, psychologically and even neurologically, we are designed to feel like we're not enough, because the brain and your psychology is not designed for you to thrive. It's designed for you to survive. So there's some level that we're always protecting ourselves. So how does someone know if they've moved into what I used to call, when I was a clinician, it was called complicated mourning. I don't know if the name has changed to complex grief, or if that's still the same thing. I remember I treated one woman who had complicated mourning. She came, you're going to love this story. She came to me as a psychotherapist. This is many years ago. She came to me in psychotherapy on the 10-year anniversary of her husband's unexpected death. And her life was literally frozen in time for 10 years, to the point where after about a year of treatment with me, and this was unusual for me, I didn't usually do this kind of thing, I literally went to her house and helped her pack up her husband's things. His comb, his toothbrush, his razor, his slippers. 10 years were all in the same place. It was the most profound case of complicated grief I'd ever seen, or certainly ever treated. And it was a very successful course of treatment. By the time we completed, she had a new boyfriend, she had a new career. The other thing that was just so sad, her entire inheritance from his life insurance, she left it in a checking account for 10 years.
Oh my.
She got a check. I think it might have been direct deposited, or she got a check and she deposited it and never did anything with it for 10 years. Yeah. So I share that, just as a way of helping people kind of connect with, there's grieving, which is a devastating experience. And then there's complicated grief, which is a very, very different thing. My own grandmother, my grandmother lost her husband and 2 of her 3 sons in 9 months' time. So I remember this as part of my family. She didn't move any of my grandfather's things for many years. And of course, nobody talked about it, like you said, back in those times. But at some point, my mother and her other remaining son just went in and took my grandfather's things out. They just did it. without talking to her. So talk to us, Michelle, a little bit about, your thoughts on what moves grief, or the difference between grief and complicated mourning. And also let's get into what people can do if they are identifying with what we're talking about today with complicated grief.
Right. So I actually have a little free assessment that people can take to find out if they have complex grief, and we can talk about that later. You can begin by asking, what your relationship with abandonment is. That's kind of the primary group of people I work with are women who have experienced abandonment in their lives. And so what happens is that when you lose somebody to death or divorce, and it's overwhelming and you can't move forward and you're stuck, that's a sign of complex grief. And then additionally, what part of the problem is that we are not taught or haven't been taught. Maybe we're getting better as we go along. When I started in this, people did not know how to grieve. When I started working in grief groups, partner loss grief groups, we're talking, that they would sit around and tell their story. And they would tell their story until they finally got tired of telling their story, and new people would come in and they would say, I don't want to do this anymore. And what I realized in my own work, for me, one of the keys was releasing your emotions. And we're not taught how to release our emotions. We play the stoic, we repress them. So one of the women, you were talking about a woman who had grieved her husband for 10 years. I work with a woman who grieved her husband for 20 years. And she came to my free group and she was literally in tears 20 years later. And it turned out that her son looked like her husband. So every time she saw him, she would burst into tears. So this was creating a little bit of a issue with her and the only person who was important in her life.
Oh.
So when I gave her permission, she thought she had grieved, but when I gave her permission to really grieve and to really allow those emotions to flow out of her body, to release them, she was better in a month.
Yeah.
She was starting to re-engage in life shortly after that. Because we hold it in our bodies, and what we don't realize is that we're actually doing physical damage to our bodies. Because when you hold emotions in, you're using all the muscles in your body to hold it in. And you'll find that there are muscular groups that are holding your emotions in. So one of the things that I do with my clients is help them to go inside and find out where it is that they're holding. And where you're holding that tension, where you're suppressing feelings, is a big key to what's going on with you in your life. And so it's kind of, if you know how to read the body, it's a doorway to open, to help you to understand what's going on. And so when I work with my clients, I don't tell them to go back into their past. I just deal with them where they are right now, what's going on in their body. And it surfaces. There's stuff that's there from wherever.
Yeah. The latest neuroscience research actually says that rehashing old wounds is not good for your recovery, that it perpetuates the neural pathways of trauma, rather than learning how to deal with the emotions, express the emotions, create new narratives, create more uplifting narratives that we have the capacity to do, but no one is taught that yet. So is that part of what you help your clients?
Absolutely. So I have a system called serve. Only it isn't that because sometimes that works when you're in grief, is if you serve other people, then you feel better. But serve is let grief serve you.
Let grief serve you. Mm-hmm.
So the S is to surrender. And oftentimes we fight the experience because we don't want to go into it. I had a friend who had lost her dog of 15 years, and she immediately went out and got another dog. And then she was disappointed because it wasn't the same dog.
Right, of course.
And so you have to surrender. You have to say, okay, it's going to be difficult, but the only way is through it.
Through it, right. It's going to hurt. I'm going to be sad. And that's normal. It's okay to spend those months or sometimes a year,
Yes.
Anniversary is always big for a major loss of a pet, a friend, a job, a loved one. Yeah. So allowing yourself, surrendering to the grief. Yeah.
And then the next one, the letter E, is immerse. Immerse yourself in the emotions, to allow the emotions to be released. And that's what I work a lot in, just in the very first part of my program with people around grief and loss, is teaching them how to release their emotions in a way that doesn't recycle it. Because that's the problem, is often we feel something and then our mind jumps in and tells us how terrible the life is, and then that triggers more emotions and it can get into a cycle. I teach people how to release that emotion without activating the brain. Oops. And then the next one is R, which is to reframe. So we want to start to change the story that we have.
The narrative, yeah.
The narrative. And I help people to change their story about, their regrets, their resentments, to change it so that they aren't taking that along with them, that they're holding it in. And then I actually help them to change their whole life narrative. We go back and we look at the story as like a mythical story. What, the princess, Morn, and what her experience is. And then to reframe the death in a different way, as how this is actually something that helps you to step further into who you really are.
Nice.
And then the next one is to vision where you're going to go next. And then the final one is to engage and express. That is to take what you've learned from your grief and give it back to the world.
Beautiful. That's a beautiful process. I love that. I was hoping the last E was going to be emerge.
Well, that there fits right in there with the E. I'll put that on.
Emerge from a grief experience, because in my experience, both as a clinician and as a person who's gone through a lot of grief in my life, I do feel like that's, you kind of go in to this very dark, painful, like the loss can be so palpable. But if you stay with it, and as you said, express it, and don't try to, drink it or drug it or work it or, work it out, or like, all the things that people do to avoid just this, kind of dark experience of loss and sadness. It's really okay. Because here's the thing, when you allow yourself to experience it, it goes away.
That's right. That's so true.
Sad forever. You allow yourself to cry when you allow yourself those, days on the couch, or, and you're conscious. When you're consciously moving through it, you do emerge. You emerge, and it's not that the grief goes away. It integrates into the whole narrative of your life and your experience and your identity. So that I was just thinking about this today. I lost a dear, dear friend of mine to cancer a few years ago, and she was a real health nut. She was a health coach, and ironically died early of cancer. She was 59 when she died. And I'm in my postmenopausal years now at 60, 61. I'm gaining weight in a way that I never have. I've been the same weight my entire life, from my teenage years to my adult years. And I was thinking, I just miss Patty. If she was here, she would know what to do and she would understand this. So, and I felt sad, and it's been 3 years since Patty died. And I had that moment of remembering, and I missed her. And that was something that we could share together. So it's not like the grief goes away, but you do emerge to a different experience of grief as you go through that process that you described, Michelle. It's really, really lovely. Are there specific things that you want to recommend people do? You're talking about, experiencing the emotions, but like concrete, practical things that you suggest people do to help them move through their experience of grief?
Meditate, breathe.
Well, now, wait a minute. Why meditation is part of grief recovery?
Because meditation takes you into the moment. It brings you into, and it also changes your brain waves. It stops the inner dialogue that can often be very, very challenging. So when you meditate, it is an incredible respite. It's actually, if you can do it well, better than TV, which I know a lot of people will get into TV because it's a way to take a break from the emotions.
Yeah, yeah.
But when you meditate, you're also doing things that are really good for your body. You're calming your body, and also you're connecting with the wider picture, the bigger and more important thing. And because everything that I do is so based spiritually in why we're here and what we're here to do, what we're here to complete, when you start to reframe your experience and see it as, okay, maybe there was a reason. And boy, working with a lot of my clients, I can see why things happened in that framework. And it helps because it helps relieve the resentment, and it helps relieve the regrets that we have, because it's part of our journey. It's part of our own healing. It's part of our own empowerment. If we can use it that way, if we don't shut down, if we don't close down.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I love that you mentioned meditation. I hadn't thought of that as part of recovery from grief, but it's so central to our well-being in every way that I'm so glad you said that first. Another one I think about is being connected to people. There's a tendency in grief to kind of withdraw or feel like you're too much. People can't tolerate my grief. And there's a sense of wanting to isolate. Maybe that's something you could address with us, is the need.
Absolutely. So it engage is also part of engaging with other people. And it's actually the second module in my program is getting people to reach out to get that support, because we are social animals. We are wired to bond. You break that bond, and it has a physical impact. Yeah, I learned very early that we literally trigger the fight, flee, freeze response in our body when we lose somebody.
When we lose somebody.
When we lose somebody, because we're social beings, and our survival depends upon connection with other people. When you break a significant bond, it triggers that survival response. Interesting. You can see it in a lot of different ways. I mean, if you think about it symbolically, when we plenty of people will travel all over the world, or that's fleeing, or they get into arguments with their family, or they get into arguments with the medical community. That's the fight. Yeah. And then the freeze is when, you don't get out of bed, when you kind of become comatose. It's like you just
or drink too much,
or you drink too much, right?
Netflix binge, or pornography binging. People do all kinds of things to numb out, and that is part of that freezing as well. Not being able to move out of that numbing experience.
So we need other people.
Yeah.
We need to create new bonds. And that's scary, because you're like, oh my gosh, I just lost somebody.
I just lost somebody. Right. But I'm sure you're aware of this. The longest study on longevity, the study out of Harvard University, the Harvard Longevity Study, shows that the number one factor for longevity is relationships. More than health, more than exercise, more than nutrition. The number one factor that will guarantee your longevity is having a small group of people that you feel a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, a sense of connection, and a sense of support with. It can be a church group, it can be a family group, it can be a community group where you volunteer. I mean, we just lost Jimmy Carter a month or so ago. And I think part of his making it to 100 years was he was doing work at Habitat for Humanity well into his 90s, and family support. And he's such a good iconic figure of that sense of connection to community, connection to family. So yeah, when we isolate in our grief, we're really hindering that process of recovery and emerging to the other side of it. My grandmother, who had lost her husband and her two sons, she ended up dying many years later in a nursing home because she had had dementia for many, many years and had moved out of the very rural area of upstate New York. My uncle took her down to the Buffalo, New York area instead of the Thousand Islands region. And so she'd been gone from the community for about 15 years. And so when she passed, we did have calling hours and a small service back in our hometown area, very small rural area. And I thought, who's going to come? My grandmother's been gone out of the area for 15 years. I figured it'd be myself, my aunt, my uncle, my siblings, a few cousins. There was a line out the door. There was a line out the door of people coming to pay their respects. And they all had a story of if I had another lifetime, I would make a film of it and they called her Grace because my grandmother's name was Grace. They all had a story to tell about watching her go through that terrific tragedy loss of her husband and 2 sons in 9 months, and how she was such an icon and a pillar of the community, volunteering at church and for the what was it where American Cancer Society, those daffodils that they'd give out daffodils if you'd give a donation to the American Cancer Society. It was something in our small rural town that everyone did. She would have the whole table filled with daffodils and people's names of who had given, that she was going to go door to door and deliver these daffodils for their contribution to the American Cancer Society. I hope I'm remembering the charity correctly. But anyway, and it speaks of that sense of my grandmother really knew in her grief of losing, her husband and 2 sons in such a short period of time. She threw herself into relationships. Thank goodness for myself. She threw herself into caring for my brother and sister and myself, who we had lost our father. And she threw herself into the community. She was just a pillar. So if any of you listening to Michelle and I today are in that place of grief, I really want to highlight the things that we're talking about and how to move through it. Feel your feelings, meditate to quiet your mind, and connect with other people in community. So, Michelle, anything you want to leave people with before we wrap up? And I would love it if you tell us about that grief assessment that you mentioned.
Yes. So you can get the grief assessment by going to www.complexgriefchecklist.com.
Oh, cool. ComplexGriefChecklist.com. That's very easy to remember. That's lovely. I love that. Well, thank you so much for being with us here today, Michelle. It's just been lovely to kind of revisit some of these older experiences of my life, remembering my complex grief as a clinician and treating people around that, and how very heartening it was to walk people through that. And then, of course, my own recovery from grief as well. So thank you for bringing such an important topic. We here at the Conscious Living podcast are talking about conscious living, but there's also conscious dying and how we navigate the death and losses in our lives. So thank you for being here with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.